Hello, bonjour, buenos dias. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and I have the privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders from around the world, but really focusing on the needs and opportunities identified by our partners in East Africa and the Middle East. It's through research, co-designed research, training, knowledge mobilization, and policy engagement discussions such as these that LERRN is trying to contribute to a shift in enhancing the role of civil society and refugee-led initiatives in the governance of the global refugee regime. And in that context, I want to say how delighted I am to be involved with this webinar as part of our ongoing collaboration with our seat. Puedo acceder a la interpretación entre español e inglesa a través del botón de interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla. So to access interpretation, as I'll explain in a moment, please use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I live and work, and the land where Carleton University is found, is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I say that not only out of respect and protocol and an appreciation for being a guest on this land, but out of a recognition that these questions that we discuss today in terms of participation, in terms of accountability, and in terms of power are very much a part of the history of the land on which I live and work. And I invite those of you in colonial context to take a moment to reflect on the land where you currently reside. Let me say how delighted I am to welcome some 340 registrants to this webinar today. The level of interest in this webinar is really a testament to the importance of this topic and the moment at which we find ourselves in the governance of the global refugee regime. This is a special webinar with our seats in thinking about the high-level officials meeting and learning lessons from the Global Refugee Forum on meaningful refugee participation. So as I said, it is such a thrill to be co-hosting this event with our seat, Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table. And it has really been a thrill for LERRN, and I'd like to say a personal highlight of my career working with our seat on questions of meaningful refugee participation as an emerging norm. Having worked on questions of the politics and governance of the global refugee regime over the past 25 years, I have to say that the question of refugee participation is one of the most exciting areas of development and an area that I think gives us great hope, not only in terms of questions of accountability, but in questions of effectiveness and impact in advancing the core commitments of the refugee regime. And I look forward to this discussion today and learning from all of the participants. But before we begin, let me take a moment and do some of the technical points to help us through the next hour and a half. As I noted, please note that this webinar is supported by interpretation between English and Spanish. My sincere thanks to the interpreters for providing this essential support. You can access interpretation through the interpretation button at the beginning of the screen. And please note that we will have speakers participating both in English and in French. So you will likely need to make use of that service. Again, puede acceder a la interpretación entre español e inglesa a través del botón de interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Sorry. Second, please note that this webinar is in the view-only format. And so we do invite you to pose your questions and your comments. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I will be curating the comments and questions in a discussion period that we will have in the second half of the webinar. But please be respectful in posting your questions in the Q&A box. Inappropriate behavior or the use of hurtful or harmful language will lead to your removal from this webinar. Third, if you have any technical questions during the webinar, please send us an email to learn@carleton.ca as it shows up on the screen. And please join the conversation on the platform formerly known as Twitter by tagging our seat or @learning on social media, and we'll be able to help promote that conversation in a virtual space. Let me also really underscore that this webinar is based on a discussion of the really important 2024 report that was published by our seat that reflected on refugee participation at the 2023 Global Refugee Forum. The title of the report was "We Were Seen, but Where Were We Heard?" If you haven't yet read the report, I highly recommend that you take some time to read it. It really is an excellent report. You can access it online through that link that has just been posted. And let me add a special word of appreciation for Marissa Leo Gomez-Sanet, our seat's partnership and stakeholder advisor, who's played an exceptional role in her leadership, not only in bringing the report to fruition, but all of the work in making this webinar possible. So thank you very much, Marissa. Let me finally say that the webinar is being recorded. And the recording will be posted on the website, both of LERRN and our seat in the coming weeks. So here's the link for the LERRN website. You can check that, but you'll also be able to see it by following us on social media. So with that, I hope you enjoy the webinar. I know I'm going to learn a lot from this conversation, and I hope you find it meaningful and helpful as well. And to begin, I'm happy to introduce someone from whom I always learn so much when I hear her speak. We were together yesterday running a training in New York City, and I was delighted to learn so much in that context. And so to begin the webinar today, it's my real pleasure to invite Rez Gardi, our seat's co-managing director, to offer some introductory comments. Rez's bio is posted in the chat. But without further ado, Rez, let me pass the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much, James. Roj bash salavorez bohamwa. Tena koto katoa enamana enareo enofenua oteao norera tena koto katoa. I greet you firstly in my mother tongue Kurdish, and I greet you secondly in Te Reo Māori, the language of the Tangata Whenua Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I was fortunate to be settled as a refugee and find a home free from persecution. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from New York on the unceded lands of the Lenape people. Kia ora, good morning, good day, good evening, wherever in the world you're calling in from. My name is Rez Gardi. I'm the co-managing director of Refugee Seeking Equal Access at the Table, or our seat for short. It's a pleasure to welcome you all, and thank you so much for joining this important discussion. A big thank you to our partners at the Local Engagement Research Refugee Research Network, LERRN, for co-hosting this timely webinar. Our seat is an international refugee-led organization working to enhance the effectiveness of global refugee responses by co-designing mechanisms which amplify refugee leadership ecosystems and increase the participation of refugees at state levels in a meaningful, sustainable, and transformative way. As part of this mission, our team worked on a report titled "We Were Seen, but Were We Heard?", which assessed the quality of refugee participation at the 2023 Global Refugee Forum. This research was informed by interviews with members of the group of 70 forcibly displaced and stateless experts identified by UNHCR and UNHCR's advisory board, the different representatives from refugee-led organizations from all around the globe, members of the advisory board to UNHCR, and also refugee advisors that formed part of their state delegations to the GRF. Today, we're here to reflect on the key findings of that report alongside refugee participants who attended the GRF in 2023 in a range of different roles. We'll explore what progress has been made and what lessons we must carry forward as we look ahead to the high-level officials meeting in December this year. As our report outlines, GRF 2023 saw a notable increase in participation from individuals with lived experience of forced displacement, rising from 72 participants at the first GRF in 2019 to 328 refugee participants in 2023. This included a number of the UNHCR Advisory Board, the group of the 70 experts, and a growing number of refugee-led organizations which were invited to participate in the GRF in 2023. 14 states also included refugees in their official delegations, most in advisory roles, and many international NGOs and other stakeholders supported or invited refugee leaders to engage in different capacities. Yet while the participation increased in numbers, challenges remain in ensuring that this engagement was meaningful. And this matters because as UNHCR and partners prepare for the high-level officials meeting, we do so in an increasingly difficult context, with rising anti-refugee sentiment, intensifying displacement crises, and major funding constraints. While the high-level officials meeting represents an important moment to take stock of progress in the pledge cycle, it is also an opportunity to shape the trajectory towards the GRF in 2027. In these uncertain times, meaningful refugee participation must remain front and center. When refugees are involved in shaping the solutions, these solutions are more effective, more sustainable, and more grounded in the realities that we face every day. The global refugee landscape has shifted significantly since we launched this report. But rather than allowing that to deter us, we believe it makes our mission even more urgent. Now more than ever, meaningful refugee participation must be recognized as a cornerstone of global refugee policy. And so, with this conversation today, we're so grateful to have a tremendous panel of speakers, each of whom brings both deep expertise and lived experience to this conversation. And we're so grateful to each of you for being part of this important dialogue. So, without further ado, let's begin. And I hand back to you, James, to kick us off. Thank you so much. And Amana and
Thank you so much, Rez. That's really, really helpful. And I think it's really important to frame our discussion in the light of what we hope that refugee participation brings in enhancing the effectiveness of the system that has been with us for so many decades, but is in a constant process of evolution. It is important to remember how much progress we've made in the past 10 years with the New York Declaration and the work that went into the Global Compact on Refugees, and to recognize the value of this new opportunity for multi-stakeholder engagement. And this is what's so important about the Global Refugee Forum and the high-level officials meeting, is that while the decision-making moments of the global refugee regime that we find either in Geneva with the UNHCR's executive committee, or we find in New York with the third committee of the UN General Assembly, or the Economic and Social Committee, ECOSOC, with its special meeting coming up in April. In the context of the GRF and the high-level officials meeting, there is this very tangible moment for non-state actors to be involved, not only in discussions about advancing the opportunities and the commitments and the priorities of the Global Compact on Refugees, these really critical 4 areas of priority in terms of enhancing self-reliance and pursuing opportunities and enhancing international solidarity and burden and responsibility sharing. And the moment that we have coming up in December of 2025 with the high-level officials meeting is that moment to take stock, is to be able to say, from the commitments that were made in December of 2023 and the hundreds of commitments that were made. Already we've had a question in the Q&A box about monitoring implementation And we'll get to that in the discussion time. But we have this opportunity where non-state actors are able to play a role not only in the process of pledges and monitoring the implementation of pledges, but in really shaping that innovation, which is at the heart of the progressive evolution of the global refugee regime over the past 75 years. So to think about the opportunities that we have coming from the Global Refugee Forum in 2023 and looking ahead to the high-level officials meeting in December of 2025, we have really four wonderful and distinguished speakers with us to engage with these questions of process, of experience, and opportunities. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker and pose them a question that builds from their experience, that helps us understand the scope of the moment that we face at the moment. Their full biographies will appear as a link in the chat box, and so please take advantage of that. And our first speaker is Ana Valle, the honorary president of the Association of Nicaraguans in Mexico. And Ana, you have been involved in the pledging process, not only in the Cartagena plus 40 process, which was part of a multi-stakeholder pledge that was made in the years to advance the Chilean Declaration and Action Plan as a framework to strengthen protection and solution responses for asylum seekers, refugees, and displaced and stateless persons in the region. But you've also been involved with the process around commitments around legal aid provision for refugees and asylum seekers within the region. So what I'm keen to hear from you, Ana, is what is the experience that you can bring and on the role of refugee participation throughout the Cartagena plus 40 event and process, and what lessons we can learn from that. But also, where do you see there as opportunities to improve the role of refugee participation in the pledging process and in the pledging cycle? I'll note to everyone that Ana will be speaking in Spanish, so please make use of the interpretation. Ana, por favor.
Hello, good day. First and foremost, I would like to thank the LERRN network in face of this high-level committee where all these commitments will be established, and especially in this context, which is a bit critical for the asylum system and people that request international protection. Before starting my presentation, I would like to talk about Cartagena. The Declaration of Cartagena is a legal instrument for the Latin American region. It is a non-binding document from the 84, and it talks about solidarity, about cooperation in the region, and it's an instrument that recommended a broader scope. Some people have implemented, some countries have implemented it in local scales, but what does this mean? Well, external aggression, internal aggression, violation of human rights, and other circumstances that endanger public safety. So there we can talk about acknowledgement about displaced people in groups. In its 40s university, there was a commitment established for the creation of a plan of each decade. It's called the Chile Action Plan, done every 10 years. And here we talk about a multitasking actor mechanism. Here we include organizations led by immigrants, and this began with my participation in 2023 in a forum where I represented my organization, and it was already part of a dialogue process from the UNHCR and other Mexican bodies. So we did a call to all different organizations to add up and therefore we look for a voice together, which we articulated in several organizations. And right now we have a relay group called GRLOs that is from Latin American countries and Caribbean countries. And we have over 160 organizations now. So this presented a milestone in the Cartagena document. A document that talked about our diversity as a population. And we created a method within these organizations in which we talk about gender, about equality, where we seek to provide equality for everyone, especially for those people that don't have the chance to sit on the table and do their proposals. Thinking of proposals, in Chile, we talked about propositions, and some people from other continents, from Africa, from other locations, they came to us. And this enabled the opening of different doors. For example, human rights, a consolidation of peace between civil society. And we saw that this helped our know-how and also helped us to know how can we create an impact in our society. So starting from there, this positive response, what we concluded that we could not stop in Cartagena. We created a pledge as a region to strengthen our groups of displaced people, for example, and where we look for the inclusion of our voices. We want to include leaders and everyone interested, because something that we're seeing is that there are still people that are displaced by force, and they are going to continue to mobilize collectively. So we created this commitment, but after we've seen all of this, we know there are still challenges. We are trying to break barriers such as language, things like resources to communicate between each other. In Latin America, we don't only speak Spanish, we have indigenous community, we also speak English. So that was a barrier because we had to depend of the UNHCR or stakeholders for interpretation. Something that we see also is that we need to strengthen this training on the asylum system. We see that there are people that are not aware of the asylum system, and that is a right for people. So one has the knowledge, and we can establish correctly in a place and legally. And another subject, another challenge that we have is how to define the word displaced. Is it asylum? Because we want to contextualize what a migrant really is, because there are several situations. Another challenge that we have is that the participation of refugees should be something demanded, and we don't see it that way right now, because their decisions are going to affect the lives of the society. So the follow-up of these commitments we establish it must involve a participation. And there we can recognize the knowledge of everyone in the field with our technical capacities, and this will enable other stakeholders to have that insight firsthand that regularly we can take to the decision-making tables. So to sum it up, that's the vision that we've had in the construction of in the Global Forum and in my participation with the commitments. Thank you very much.
Gracias. That's a really helpful beginning to our conversation, and a very tangible set of examples on the opportunities that exist and some of the barriers. I also note, Anna, the point that you make about the value of interregional dialogue in learning from processes in other regions and bringing that experience in. And so the kind of dialogue that we have in this webinar, I think it will highlight the added value of maintaining those kinds of opportunities. So thank you for that. And in terms of dialogue and learning, I'm happy now to turn to Jal Dak, who is joining us from Uganda, where he is the founding director of the Youth Social and Advocacy Team, YSAT. He's also a member of UNHCR's advisory board. This board has really been an exciting site of innovation in terms of how diverse perspectives of experts with lived experience of displacement bring not only their lived experience, but their expertise in how these issues on the global agenda can reflect the realities in different operational contexts and build that link between the various regional perspectives and how we frame a global agenda to respond in that way. So, Jal, I'd like to turn to you now and ask you questions about the experience with UNHCR's advisory board. Both in terms of the experience with the 2023 Global Refugee Forum. What was the experience and what lessons we can take away from the participation of the advisory board in the Global Refugee Forum in 2023, but then looking ahead to the high-level officials meeting in December of this year in 2025. What role do you hope or can we anticipate the advisory board playing in the preparations, not just in the event itself, but in setting the agenda and identifying the priorities for the high-level officials meeting in December 2025? Jal, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure, of course, to meet everyone in the call. My name is Jal. I am the UNHCR Global Advisory Board member in my second term now, and together with my wonderful colleagues. And I also co-chair of the Charter for Change Localization Working Group in Uganda. And I lead Youth Social Advocacy Team, YSAT, which is a regional refugee-led organization that works in Uganda and South Sudan. Our role as a UNHCR Advisory Board was established just to provide strategic policy advice based on our experiences, the different organizations, because we are 16 of us, and we also the voices of the organizations that we represent. This includes refugee-led organizations, organizations led by persons with disabilities, women-led organizations, to mention. And we are spread across all the regions of UNHCR, and we have very clear roles, around 5 of them. One of the roles is that we assist the UNHCR task team in developing and defining the guiding principle for equal and meaningful participation at policy and strategic level. We also contribute to guidance on meaningful participation of displaced persons. We support the follow-up on Global Refugee Forum, just as you mentioned, the pledges that many states, partners, and host countries actually expressed. We also highlight gaps and identify promising practices of partnership with organizations led by displaced people. And of course, lastly, we also support the identification and coaching of organizations led by displaced and stateless people. And this also includes representation and recommendations, especially during the Global Refugee Forum in 2023. We participated in supporting the selection of 70 refugee experts from across all countries that UNHCR worked in, who participated in GRF in Geneva. Those are specific roles that we play as UNHCR advisory board members, particularly about the high-level official meetings. The advisory board members play very critical roles, and I'm happy to highlight them. One is that we continue the engagement in pledge follow-up, just as I mentioned before. This is one of our key roles. both at global and regional level. We also actively participate in consultations on a high-level official meeting program and also planning meaningful refugee participation side events, co-leading the drafting of joint statement for plenaries. These are things that we really have been engaged in, and we also look forward to this event in December. We also participate in preparatory processes, including global and regional briefings and consultations. Of course, we also participate at the in-country event in Geneva when the event starts. We also advocate for thematic priorities that reflect the concerns of refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons, just to make sure the event reflects our needs and our priorities. And we also ensure that we co-lead and facilitate sessions, discussion, and moderations. Some of our colleagues during the 2023 GRF were able to co-lead such. Some of the refugees read statements on stage and on the side events, and this is some of the tasks that we also advocate on behalf of the organization we represent. We also advocate for greater representation. Yes, as the report says, that we were seen, but where we had better representation in GRF 2023, but many of the participants were just the spectators. They were there for the camera, or for the sessions, or for the photos, and everyone just wrote reports that we got refugees as part of our delegation, we got refugees as part of our team that went to Geneva, but what did they do? You know, what did they say? Or they were just there to listen and then come back. So this is one of our role, that refugees are meaningfully engaged, that they just don't go to Geneva for the sake of numbers. And also we highlight the impact of global funding crisis, especially now that a lot of refugee-led organizations are really, really affected, not just refugee-led, but also even national NGOs in all refugee hosting countries have been affected by this refugee crisis, and also the funding crisis by the US decision and other countries following. So this is very key, and that it's a role we are following. Lastly on that is that we advocate for post high-level official meeting, regional and in-country engagement and consultation, because most time when we go to Geneva, we enjoy, we share very many beautiful photos, and that's it. We don't give back to the communities that we have gone to represent. So this is a key advocacy area that we highlight as the AB member to UNHCR. And on the suggestions or inputs on what we can do better, while refugee participation improved in 2023 GRF, for example, where we had 70 refugee experts, we're asking that this year, the numbers should increase, but they shouldn't just increase to fill the rooms and the chairs. They should increase, but they should be active in all side events, all plenaries, all statements, and the presentation on stage, because these events are for us, and therefore we should be part of it. This also include we co-creating the statements, co-moderating, and then co-leading side events. Second suggestion I also have as a lesson learned from 2023 is that many refugee-led organizations face barriers with participating. They want to send a representative, but they don't have funds. So we kindly request the partners that work with refugee-led organizations to provide them support in terms of finance and logistics so that they're able to participate. In 2023 as well, we had a huge number of refugees denied visas by countries that were issuing it. And therefore, for example, in Uganda, we had, I think, about 23 members of the refugee-led network in Uganda, RLORN. About 23 members of theirs were all denied visas, and only 2 from Kenya who had access to that. So this is denying space and access to the people that you're inviting. And I think that's unfair, right? So we hope that this can improve, and that we can work collaboratively with the organizers to make sure that this year the numbers get to increase, but also the participation get to increase. We are also requesting that The infrastructure has to be improved. Not everyone can go to Geneva. So if we can have options for online streaming, virtual participation, so that even those who don't reach Geneva are able to access, it will be great. And lastly, tracking progress of the GRF pledges remain high. I think this remains in Geneva and in partners, and that the people on ground that we are communicating, for example, in Uganda, you have 1.7 million, you're deciding their future in Geneva, but they don't know what's going on. I think it would be fair to organize pre-event consultations, you live stream during the event, and then have post-GRF or post-high-level official meeting engagement in country and at regional level, so that the people we are serving and we're working with are able to hold us accountable. I thank you.
No, thank you very much, Jal, and some really tangible pieces in there. In the report, there is that discussion. Yes, the funding piece, but the visa question and how that question of overcoming very tangible barriers to participation. So there's the question of barriers to participation that exist in a substantive way, right? As you said, being present but being able to influence the outcomes. And I think there's been a lot of really good work on those questions, but not to lose sight of the barriers, the very practical barriers to participation, funding, visas, what have you, but making use of opportunities such as remote participation, with the significant investment with renovations in the Palais des Nations in Geneva, make use of that technology for virtual participation. But also the point that you raised about regional consultations and connections. It's interesting, in their plenary statement at the Global Refugee Forum in December 2023, the government of Kenya actually made the suggestion, could we not have intervening regional events that sort of build opportunities, and Anna, it links to sort of the power in the Americas of the Cartagena plus 40 process. Imagine at this time of uncertainty and existential concern for the refugee regime, if we could build that momentum with refugee participation from different regional contexts and have that momentum then mobilize and sort of crescendo in the Geneva space, could be quite exciting. On the question of participation, there was a question in the chat box about the Sharika plan process in Kenya. Please note this is a process that our seat has been following very closely, and I direct you to the our seat social media channels for the materials they've been presenting on that. So, Jal, lots for us to think about. Thank you. And on that question of participation, Nejra, let me come to you. We're really delighted. Nejra Sumic, who's joining us as a senior national field manager with We Are All America, and also an advisor with the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board. And Nejra, you were a representative for the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board at the Global Refugee Forum in 2023. So with that very practical experience in terms of the role of refugee advisors within state delegations, which we now see 13 countries at the GRF in 2023 had refugee advisors and their delegation, which many take as a sign of progress. But I'd love to hear your perspective on how states can improve on the participation of advisors within state delegations in a way that's very pragmatic and structured, but also balancing that. What are the very specific impacts that or the achievements that refugee advisors in state delegations, what are they able to achieve, or what do they hope to achieve by virtue of participating within state delegations, which is complementary to refugee participation in so many different spaces? Nejra, let me pass the floor to you, please.
Good morning or afternoon, depending where you're at. Thank you so much for that question, and James, and thank you so much for having me in this panel. Again, my name is Nejra Sumic, and I am an advisor on the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board. And just briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with USRAB, we were initially launched in 2022, in partnership with 3 organizations, Refugee Congress, Refugee Council USA, and Georgetown University Institute for Study of International Migration. And USREP is really a mechanism that aims to facilitate the active involvement of forcibly displaced populations in relevant regional and international policy discussions. And the board's role is really to collaborate with key international governments and other refugee-led initiatives such as RC. So during my role during the GRF, as you mentioned, James, I attended as part of the U.S. delegation representing as a refugee advisor. My experience overall was a very positive one, I will say. I would have 3 recommendations in looking ahead into 2027 and future GRFs on what we could maybe do to improve. The first recommendation I have is having states establish a better refugee advisory mechanism during the actual GRF and having a more effective, robust communication system. And so what I mean by that is, for example, ensuring timely onboarding prior to the GRF, given that the GRF is such a tremendous undertaking. I think having that onboarding information helps advisors be much better prepared. Really outlining clearly overall objective and tasks. This includes things like just logistics such as the itinerary, having a clear expectation for what during the GRF, what the advisor should expect, and also importantly, like who the point of contact is within a timely manner. For some folks, this may be the first time attending the GRF, and so I think understanding the expectations is really important and having this information ahead of time. And then also post GRF, having a debrief session and engaging leaders in that debrief is really important as well. The second recommendation I would make is a substantive internal integration of refugee advisors to the delegation. Some of the examples I would provide is looking into creating more opportunities for refugee advisors to play a more integral role, such as supporting or having a speaking or moderating role in a state-led session, or partaking in meetings. Also providing more like clear insights into any specific goals, topics to abstain from, or deliverables that we might need to provide during the delegation. And then finally, my third recommendation would be to ensure that refugee voices are heard and that there are actual tangible and that they can have a tangible influence on the outcomes. And what I mean by that is provide refugee advisors with opportunities where they can contribute to the work of the delegation as a whole, and for them to be presented with opportunities to provide their insights, to provide their technical expertise. For example, providing refugee advisors with a portion of time to speak during the plenary, inviting them to attend bilateral meetings, offering them speaking opportunities and strategic interjections during potentially side events, providing refugee advisors opportunity to contribute their professional insights, again, their technical expertise to statements being made by the delegation, their plenary statement, and developing pledges. So I think those would be my 3 recommendations, like very programmatic recommendations for advisors attending with state delegations. In terms of specific goals that refugee advisors and state delegations would like to see, I think along lines of what Jal was saying, we really want to advocate for systematic inclusion. of refugees in the decision-making process. We want to strive to establish participation as a standard practice rather than a symbolic gesture, right? Where we're really seeing systemic inclusion and changes in that. And this really involves continued engagement and ongoing dialogue, not just during the GRF, but post GRF. And I think that's really important as well. And then, of course, what Jal mentioned, continuing to work towards increasing resources and access, even for the next GRF in 2027. So let's not stop there where where we were at 2023. Let's work from now until 2027 GRF to increase things like resources for a refugee participation and making sure that we can actually get them there. So those would be my recommendations, and thank you, James. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, and really very concrete and very actionable recommendations. And I think this again is something that comes up in the report. And Jal, it links to the point that you made that it's not just about the point that our seat has made so often, and many leaders in this space, that it's not the tokenistic box ticking, presence counting, attendance, but it's really that impact and the ability to influence outcomes before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. And I think that continuity of engagement is really that key piece that I think we can take away. And Anna, to your point about the role in the pledging process, we really start to see this comprehensive picture of refugee participation, something that doesn't just happen at particular moments, but where the value of refugee participation is really in all stages of the policy process, in all stages of the design, implementation, and evaluation process, which I think is quite a critical point. And Ryan, this really brings us to your work and the role of refugee-led organizations within regions, right? As that sort of fulcrum between the global, the local, the national, and the regional. So let me now bring Ryan Figueiredo into this conversation. Ryan is the founder and the executive director of the Equal Asia Foundation. He's done really important work in the Asia Pacific region. Ryan's bio is there in the chat box. And Ryan, now to come to you with this question, given what we've been hearing at the various levels that have been discussed, as someone leading a nationally based refugee-led organization, what opportunities do you see to link the work between the country, the regional, and the global level as we prepare for the high-level officials meeting, not only in terms of bringing that experience and that evidence to bear, but also in terms of having that link, that accountability between what's discussed in Geneva and the realities that we've seen in daily context. But then, given those opportunities, what are the kinds of barriers, and how can we identify some of those barriers? Jal mentioned some of the barriers around visas and funding, participation, but what are the barriers that you think need to be addressed for RLOs to more meaningfully participate in the whole cycle with the Global Refugee Forum, the high-level officials meeting? So Ryan, I'm happy to pass the floor to you, please.
Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. Good evening from Thailand. My name is Ryan Figueiredo. I use he, they pronouns. And like James said, I run an LGBTI think tank, the first LGBTI think tank that focuses on queer refugees in the region. I really want to express my deep gratitude to Rez and Marissa for the opportunity to contribute to this report. And thank you for holding space for voices like mine and for your unwavering commitment to justice and inclusion in this space. I think it's also important for us to recognize queer leadership, past, present, and emerging, and to honor my queer siblings who have lost their lives simply trying to find safety. You are not you're not forgotten. Your struggle shapes our fight. My apologies. I think to kind of look at how we can tie up all uh, the work that we're doing at different levels. Um, I can only think of three things. I think recognition, resourcing, and representation. We can't connect across different levels if you're not recognized or resourced. Especially as being LGBTI refugees, we need to be equal partners and not just service providers, and what was earlier said, not just storytellers and warm bodies in a room. We're often doing the hardest work on the ground, especially with communities who face this multiple and intersecting vulnerabilities. The experiences at the grassroots level must be treated as legitimate contributions to both regional and global policy, not just anecdotes and afterthoughts. In terms of resourcing, I think many of our organizations work on shoestring budgets, and it's unrealistic to expect this kind of sustained engagement that you were talking about, James, earlier, in processes like the HLOM without dedicated financial and logistical support, including language access, tech access, and most importantly, paid participation. We're taking time off co-work that we are doing on the ground, and to be not compensated for participation and being at meetings, I think, is not only unfair, it is just, I often say time is a justice issue. I think that's something that we really need to kind of internalize. I also think that, RLO should not be an afterthought. I think this means that there should be long-term funding, and there should also be representation. And you spoke, James, earlier about power. I think that power kind of needs to happen both horizontally and vertically. We need to be able to participate both in regional hubs and convenings, but also other bodies at a global level. What we've been thinking about quite recently of how we can kind of reframe this conversation is to think about moving from a deficit framing to what we're calling as an asset framing. Refugee participation is viewed from a lens of vulnerability, crisis, or lack of something, right? But what if we begin to recognize the brilliance, the resilience, the leadership, the innovation that refugee communities, especially LGBT refugee communities with facing these multiple and intersecting vulnerabilities, bring to the table? Asset framing means defining people for their strengths and aspirations before noting their challenges and vulnerabilities. It's a refusal to reduce people to problems. And I think this framing does not necessarily ignore the pain and suffering that we're experiencing, but it refuses to let pain be our only story, right? And I think at its core, this asset framing is a way to center hope, dignity, and power in the way we work, in the content of our what we say to people, and the future of the refugee system. And perhaps this is one way we can move forward as we kind of start preparing for both HLOM and in December, as well as the next refugee forum. I think this kind of framing puts us puts us in the system as having equal power, having access to our own communities for that power. I think perhaps this is a framing that will really help us tell stories in a more empowered way, and for us to kind of not self-censor when we actually go into these places. I think it's a way to kind of demonstrate that our struggles are real, they are powerful, they are valid, and they are meaningful to the broader conversations that we are having. Thanks. Over to you, James.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Ryan. And that really echoes very powerfully to some of the questions that we're seeing in the discussion box right now, especially this question of participation in the system as it's currently framed, which is a state-based system, right? It is a regime created by states. UNHCR acts under the authority of the General Assembly, which is made up by states. So the question of participation within the system, given the current parameters of the system, versus leadership in reimagining where engagement and innovation, not only in terms of response, but being proactive where that comes. And Ryan, you raised the point not only about power, but about compensation and opportunity, and how sort of a reimagination of the role of refugee-led organizations as part of the response system more generally, as part of the spirit of localization. If there are more individuals with lived experience of displacement who are leading responses, and where there are organizations that are funded to do that work, that participation piece can become more a part of the work of those organizations. And I think that's sort of critical in thinking about the place of refugee leadership within the system as a whole. And I very much take on board your point at the beginning, the message of solidarity. One of the questions we had in the chat box is about pushback against members of the LGBTQI community, individuals who seek asylum on the basis of gender identity, sexual orientation. And I posted in the discussion box an explainer from UN Women on the general phenomenon of pushback that we're seeing globally. And I appreciate you underscoring that point. There have been many really helpful questions and points that are raised in the discussion box, and I thank everyone for the interventions that you've already raised. It gives us half an hour for a discussion between us, and building on some of the points that you've already raised, and in the discussions that we're getting from the discussion box as well. Nejra, maybe I'll start with you on your reflections on sort of what we see as barriers to participation. I mean, your intervention really sort of identified some of the opportunities as it relates to once there's inclusion within delegations, how that participation can be enhanced. We've heard from John Jal, we've heard from Ryan about other barriers to participation. I'd love to get your sense about how do we think about the barriers in a structural way? What are the barriers to refugee participation that we can imagine, and how can, like, what's the possibility that exists if we can overcome these barriers? What are the opportunities to be realized from really moving forward with refugee participation? Nejra, you've unmuted, so that's the universal sign on Zoom that you're ready to go. So let me pass it to you. What are your thoughts about how we identify and overcome these barriers, and what benefits can accrue from that?
Yeah, no, great question, James. I think the biggest barrier we're facing, and I'm just going to say it, is that there's still tokenism present in the space. And so I think we really need to get past that point and set aside the tokenism, and we just can't no longer participate on the sidelines if we really want to look at solutions around, forcibly displaced individuals and refugees, and we see that number. I was just looking at the UNHCR reports at a glance, June 2024 numbers, and each year we see that number go up higher and higher, and people are being forcibly displaced at a much higher rate. So I think we really need to understand the urgency of having people with lived experience not just be at the table, but actually developing systems and structures and really putting things into place in order for us to start seeing those long-term changes and really focus on the solutions. And so it's great that we those of us who were able to be there, but we need to actually take it to a next step further and not just stop there. And like these are true barriers, like us that the tokenism that exists still, and also like us not being authentically engaged in the development of these systems and structures that we need to put in place in order to have these solutions. So those are barriers that I see, and like we need to continue to think also creatively how we could take this to the next step. And you know, for the next 2027 GRF, what could we create with refugees in that space, and not only having more refugees attend, but how do we address this barrier as well? Thanks, James. I'll pass it back to
Yeah,
you.
no, thank you. And I think that really makes the point so critically. There's a question in the chat box if we could post the link to the RC report on the GRF 2023. Jerickson, if I can ask you to repost the link to the report, because Nejra, the point that you just raised about, you know, the move from tokenization to impact, right? To tokenization to inclusion, it really speaks to the question of moving from recognizing the value of meaningful participation, not based on lived experience, but based on expertise, right? It's a recognition that, I mean, and we hear this from our four speakers in the way that you're engaging in difficult in different levels, but also, you know, from the work of our seats and what we see in so many examples of refugee participation globally, regionally, nationally, locally, that the expertise that exists on very specific areas of pledging, very specific thematic priorities of the Global Compact itself, that it's that expertise that can lead to more effective, more efficient, more economical responses at a time when we think about you know, the gaps in funding that we've been experiencing for years and years and years in refugee responses. How localization, the logic of localization, the expertise that exists, how this is a very important site of expertise that can contribute to this shared commitment of the complementary role of refugee participation in making responses more efficient, more effective, and yes, more accountable and arguably more legitimate. And Anna, on that point, por favor, Anna, if I can come back to you, uh, because your experience in the pledging process, in the process of developing the pledges that then are evaluated at the high level officials meeting, that are then developed in the lead up to the, you know, Global Refugee Forum in future years. This pledging cycle is a site that kind of doesn't receive a lot of attention. But if we think about the hundreds, thousands of groups that are involved in developing pledges to try and enhance the work of realizing the objectives of the Global Compact on refugees, and given your involvement with these pledging groups, how do you think that these pledging entities can learn from the opportunities of refugee participation? How can we take the recommendations that Nejra was sharing in terms of involvement in meeting contexts, and how can pledging entities engage with the lived experience of forced displacement in a more systematic way? So, Anna, your thoughts on pledging entities and participation, please.
Well, I would subdivide this into two topics. First, we are about to have this high-level event or forum. So as refugees, we should have reliable information, true information. We do know that we have funding restrictions, and this is creating a crisis in the asylum system. However, as refugees, these restrictions should not limit the participation of key actors, key stakeholders. We have to innovate. We have to be flexible. The context is different from the context in 2023, which was sort of more flexible. So we should take into account the recommendation on streaming the event and discussing, for instance, the possibility of having virtual participation and how to visibilize the current crisis, taking into account the different time zones, which is key. Essentially, we are speaking about Latin America, which was almost absent in the past. In the Darien forest, for instance, that problem was not discussed. And I'm from Central America, but we have to identify the topics, the key topics, gender identity. So we should speak about the evolution of results, of pledges, and also the refugee population. What have been the positive impacts? Because our active involvement will allow us to restructure actions and provide different responses to the changes in the context. My experience is not the same as the experience of those who are currently going to the refugee process. There are also political ambiguity barriers, criminalization of refugees, for instance, and also the campaigns against xenophobia. And also, we should include the participation of host communities, forcibly led repatriation that is happening. So we have flows of foreigners that are coming, but also flows of nationals. And also remember that people should become organized and generate responses. So what to do? My colleague said that the pain should be transformed into actions. So we should diversify the use of funding, flexible funding would be needed. And we should acknowledge the work we carry out as refugees. And voluntary work also from refugees should not be taken for granted because of free of charge, or let's say voluntary work is not always possible as refugees. So these are some of the barriers we have identified and we should tackle with them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, these barriers have been so well documented. And again, in shifting the mindset that the contribution that refugee-led responses can make is very much through expertise, and that expertise needs to be part of a more efficient, a more economical, but a more effective system. And it's very much woven into the early history of the refugee regime. It's very much something that we see in different regional contexts where greater opportunities for refugee leadership and that impact plays a significant role. It was a striking moment in the very early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when international actors were forced to shelter in place. In that moment of quiet is when we fully appreciated what many of us already knew, was that refugees were already at the front line of responding. And we saw the diversity of areas where that response was being felt. And there was a commitment in 2021, 2022 to build back better. And I think in that moment to recognize there's a normative argument to make about refugee participation. And we hear this around questions of accountability, but there's a very substantive argument to make that as funding becomes more constrained, and as we need to look for innovation and opportunities, that refugee leadership is really, a key pillar of what these future configurations of the refugee regime might look like. It's worked historically, and there's great value in reflecting on that going into the future. And Ryan and John Jal, on that, I'd like to come back to you that we've had a number of questions in the chat box in the Q&A. We've had a number of reflections on this question of measuring impact. What are the mechanisms for assessing whether discussions globally are having an impact locally? It really raises the question about how do we make the argument that the role of refugee-led organizations in contexts like, in Thailand, in Uganda, in the Asia Pacific, in East Africa, that the role that organizations can play not only in generating ideas and bringing ideas to the global fore, but also in that reporting back. John Jal, you mentioned that, the idea of taking the outcomes of global discussions and ensuring that those are socialized in local and national and regional contexts. So really to get a sense of, given where we are in the current moment of the refugee regime, which has been brewing for a decade, if not more, what would you say is the substantive benefit of refugee participation? How can substantive, sustained, and meaningful participation really enhance the impact of what we are trying to do collectively? You've mentioned some of that in your interventions, both from the context of Asia and the context of East Africa. But I'm wondering if there are very specific examples or points that we can take away on this being a substantively useful of engagement beyond the ethical or the normative arguments that we would make. Who would like to go first in answering that question? John Jal, can I pass it back to you? It builds on some of what you said. Like, what would you say if someone is skeptical about refugee participation being valuable versus symbolic? What's the argument that you would make on the substantive value of refugee participation?
Thank you very much, James. This is a very good question. And every time I'm faced with this question, there are a few things that come to mind. And one is trust. Ideally, when we talk about the meaningful participation of refugees, whether refugees as refugee leaders in the structures and coordination mechanisms, whether refugees as individuals that you share report or research or assessment tools with, or whether refugees as in refugee-led organizations, I think first, allow me to say that we've come from far. Having refugee-led organizations, having refugees sit in the UNHCR advisory board, you discuss with the headquarters in Geneva. We've seen embassies forming youth sounding boards. We've seen partners forming advisory committees. I think we have come from far, and we need to acknowledge that this is a tremendous effort already put, and that what we are trying to now discuss is trust, in my opinion. Now, our discussion should be trust-based approach in terms of, can we trust the ideas that come from refugees? Of course you do, because everyone make a research, everyone wants to go and interview the refugees, everyone wants to share focus group discussions. And what do you do with those ideas? You present them to people who have resources, and you get the resources. And now you know the unfair game is you receive the resources, but you don't trust the person who gives you the idea with the resources that you got with his or her idea. This is so unfair. And I think it's a simple logic that we just need to trust who gives you the ideas. We trust their ideas. And I think we put these ideas into action. And the other one also, why we're filling rooms now and chairs, like I said before, with displaced people, but we don't take what they say later on. And I think it's just that willingness and trust that whatever decisions that displaced people share are what they value, and that if we put it into action, we can actually succeed. I think for those of you who are very good in MIL, or monitoring and evaluation, what happened to you if you design a good program and then you present it to displaced people and they reject it? What sort of impact are you going to present to that donor or the partner that supports you? Definitely none. So I think that's what should give us the importance of meaningfully engaging displaced people, not just in conversations, but in implementation, in planning, in monitoring, and also reporting and accountability in a way. In Uganda, for example, I have two examples. When COVID-19 came, we all know very well that capacity of local partners was questioned. There was no doubt. But when we had the scenario where food distribution couldn't go on because of lockdown, because of quarantining partners, particularly from WP and UNHCR, the option was the community-based organization, whether they were refugee-led or they were national-led. So our role really showcased during the COVID. Now that we are in post-COVID, I think it would be fair not to wait for another pandemic to recognize the role of refugee-led organization and refugees groups. Another key example I want to give is refugee-led schools. Currently, there is this wave that refugees are initiating schools, are initiating businesses, but then trust-wise, the private sector doesn't want to invest in that because they think, oh, refugees are just going to leave tomorrow, as an excuse, for example. So I think it's just high time that we start trust in all that we do, in our conversations, and we engage with intent rather than just engaging you because for the sake, right? I think if we can do that, I think it will be really, really good. And the last one is just the funding crisis that has just come now. I think this is, in my view, another pandemic, and it's going to have a devastating effect on refugees, IDPs, returnees, and all displaced people. And the option of engaging refugees, refugee-led organizations, local organizations of the host communities where we are, I don't think it's a question of if, it should be a question of when and how. Thank you.
Yeah, no, John, I think that's a really important point. And I'm going to come back in a moment to the question of how far we have come and to sort of recognize where we have seen that progress. But before we do, Ryan, I want to come to you as well on this same question in terms of, what is the substantive basis of the argument from the perspective of the region in which you work? Ryan, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jen. I think refugee participation really enables us to have an agile and adaptive system. I think given the funding context that we are in, I guess there's very little money to do so much work. And I think being responsive rather than reactive has always its benefits. It also allows us to kind of have a long-term view of what's happening in the world. It helps us future-proof for refugees of the future. I think lessons learned, lived experience, they all speak to a good policy design. And I think when you consider the full personhood of the forcibly displaced person or the refugee or asylum seekers, you're able to kind of not only apply a band-aid, but also to fix and repair the system in which this person is situated. I think this relevance of the policy action then becomes really important. I think it also then allows you to have more accountability, more transparency, but also allows you to be flexible and to be adaptive on the ground as we kind of react. But I also think this is a justice issue, right? I think we need to look at this from a justice lens. And if you're not taking into consideration the people who are affected, then are we designing just policies? Are we kind of operating in a framework of justice? I think these are what I would think substantive reasons why refugee participation is important. Over to you, James.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Ryan. I think that, the fact that there is the substantive argument and there is the normative argument to make, I think is really compelling. And I want to I want to build on this for sort of another round of questions to you all. Jerickson, if I can get you to post the link that I just sent in the chat box, if you can post that for everyone, please. On this question of how far we've come. And this is where I do want to say, as we look forward, there are challenges ahead. But something I've said a couple of times in the webinar is how do we learn the lessons from the progress we've made? And so posted in the box is an article that I'm happy to share. I had the pleasure of working on this with Rez Gardi and Mustafa Alio, and it's sort of a framing of the thinking of this work within our seat. And I share that because of the first section of the article that really traces the history of how refugee participation has grown and evolved over time, and how it really has been a collective effort. Yes, with the critical leadership of advocates with lived experience of displacement, with their expertise. We think of the Global Refugee Summit in 2018 as this critical moment of building this work, the work of the Network for Refugee Voices, and ensuring that paragraph 34 is in the Global Compact on Refugees, but really critical support within UNHCR, different groups within UNHCR that have been champions of refugee participation. In my own country context, within the Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada, the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, having counterparts within these institutional contexts who have recognized the substantive value of participation, collaborated in developing mechanisms for participation, but also we see within the international humanitarian community in the recognition of localization as being cost effective and an important thing to do. So as we think about, yes, how far we have yet to go, but also over the past 10 years, I think of the World Humanitarian Summit in Turkey and really clearly articulating the value of localization, which is, John Jal, at the core of what you're saying. The work on the Global Compact on Refugees, having that affirmed by the UN General Assembly. We have a very strong foundation on which to build. There are questions now in terms of, how refugee participation is linked with participation of migrant groups, all right, not just refugees, but migrants as well, and the progress that's made there. Several of you have mentioned the importance of linking with host community organizations, ensuring that refugee participation is representative of the great diversity of experiences of displacement, different groups within refugee communities. So I'd like to invite you with the last 2 minutes that we have. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds. What is your hope for the future of refugee participation? If we look back 10 years from now on the change, if we say in the last 10 years we've seen this lasting change happen, what do you hope will be the lasting change that we see in the next 10 years? What's your hope for what can be achieved through these kinds of conversations and the kind of system level change that we hope to see? What's your hope for the future? Who'd like to get us started? Anna, por favor, go ahead, please.
Yes, I want to comment. Yes, aside from doing analysis of the 10 years, there are certain uncertainties. There are several organizations led by refugees that are being affected by the current context. Yes, this restriction of funds will affect their participation significantly. And I think we need to replan the current model in the first place. I think we need to articulate better to recognize the importance and strengthen the collaboration in any space where regulations is discussed in regards to asylum. We need to reflect the needs of each community, and this is what articulation is all about, because we are going to be affected all by the current context, and the leadership help promote at a local level this harmonization or this standardization at level. At the High Commissioner made a reflection. He asked if we do a new agreement, will all states sign it? And I think the answer would be no, because right now we're in a debate of refugees. We're also talking about refugees from the LGBTQ community. We're practically in a competition for funds. So we need a space where we need to assure that all of our voices, if, for example, if you don't have enough funds, well, let's develop things virtually. For example, like we're doing right now, we're understanding each one, the defend the advocacy of human rights, the advocacy of the rights of refugees at local scale, national scale, global scale, and those practices to be reality. And another thing that we need to fight, even against the UN that right now is in crisis, is human rights. Human rights are in crisis. We need to create together something that shows the elements of what significant integration and collaboration means. We need to be recognized as people that can create recommendations and have the know-how for the humanitarian processes. So I would go more for this type of events with the help moral or of waiting for more funding, because I don't think that funding is coming. If there's no funding for trips, this cannot be a limit for us. This cannot be a line for us. We need to be more committed. We need to use platforms such as this one online so we can defend the rights of everyone.
Thank you so much, Anna. Let's go Nejra, and then Jal, and then Ryan with final thoughts in that order, please. Nejra, go ahead.
Yes, and I'll be brief. I agree with everything that Anna's saying. I think I also envision like the development of advisory boards all over the globe, right? Like seeing the advisory boards present in every country, and then the increase in number of refugees that attend the next GRF and future GRFs, and just systems change in the long process. The overall systems change, and I know it is a long journey, but we will get there. And I'll pass it to Ryan or John.
Jal, why don't you go ahead, and then to Ryan, please. Thank you, Nejra.
Thank you very much. And allow me to be more ambitious for the future. One is that I think I'm hopeful that the future will be more locally led in terms of humanitarian response, where refugees and refugee-led organizations will lead. More displaced people will become leaders, I hope so that they can go back and bring peace to their countries, including my country. And well-educated displaced people that will become useful citizens when they finally return, including myself. And that's my hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jal. Let me just add a comment from a bookmark that our seat passed around a couple of years ago. In a year when we think about who will be elected as the next High Commissioner for Refugees, the first High Commissioner for Refugees was a refugee. Why not the next? Ryan, over to you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, James. I think our hope is not just to be included, but to lead. We want a future where LGBTIQ refugees are at the center of shaping systems that claim to protect us, where our voices drive social policy, not just on panel discussions like this, where our identities are not a barrier to participation, but a source of insight, strength, and vision. We're not asking to be heard, we are claiming the space. and we are claiming to lead with purpose, with dignity, and with power. Thank you again for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I think that's such an important place to conclude our discussion. There's so much to say, but let me just say a sincere thanks to you, Ryan, Jal, to Nejra, and to Anna. Thank you for your expertise, your vision, and the hope that gives us. Having followed the politics of the global refugee regime for 25 years, I firmly believe that lasting change takes time. And what all of you have shared with us are very clear, actionable suggestions on where and how we can move forward in this time of existential crisis for the refugee regime, a time of uncertainty. And I encourage everyone in the audience to take hope from this, not only in terms of inspiration, but in very practical steps that we can take. Let's build from that expertise and continue to build a better refugee response system that is led by the expertise and the knowledge that comes from those who themselves have experienced displacement. So my sincere thanks to all of the speakers. Sincere thanks to the interpreters in supporting our dialogue, in overcoming the hegemonic status of the English language. This is something that we can do in virtual spaces. Let's continue to build on that. So thank you to the interpreters. Thank you to the team from LERRN, to Jadukson, to Nadia, to Lily, Rachel, everyone from the LERRN team who's helping the technical aspects in the background. And a sincere thanks, Rez, for your opening comments, to Marissa for all of your work, to the entire RC team for the work that you do every day in advancing not just the principle, but the practice of meaningful refugee participation. It's such a privilege to support your efforts. And finally, to sustain an audience of over 100 for the full 90 minutes of the webinar is a wonderful thing. And to the comments and questions in the Q&A box, to all of you giving of your time, thank you. This is a critical question that we need to continue. I ask everyone, please take a moment to answer the survey that you'll receive on how we can enhance the online experience of the webinar. Please do look for the recording, read and share the RC report, and let's all contribute to enhancing the effectiveness and the efficacy of the global refugee regime to achieve its long-standing objectives of ensuring protection and solutions, both with and for refugees. Thank you, everyone. Wherever you are, stay safe, stay well. I look forward to continuing this conversation in other ways. Take care. Thank you.